Hello and welcome. This video is looking at the structure and the language of Koine Greek, the language of the New Testament. This is about giving you an idea of what we look for when translating the Bible. And before we start to actually learn the Greek, we need to get an idea of the relevant grammar in English. Some of the terms and concepts we use when translating are not that well known in English now. It's been taken off the English language syllabuses decades ago and is not commonly known about. This video is going to give a bit of an overview of that sort of grammar, looking at learning the Greek New Testament and what it means in English. By the way, as you look through this channel, you'll see there's a bit of a color coding. The blue is the explainer videos. The green ones with the green background will give you a chance to practice what you've learnt, and then there's ones with the purple background. They are for learning vocabulary. As we begin, there's a few things that I would like you to keep in mind. Firstly, as I said in the earlier videos, capital letters are not used at the start of sentences, but they are used for the start of paragraphs, for proper nouns, and at the start of speech. Secondly, word order does not matter as much as it does in modern languages. In modern languages, we convey a lot of the meaning about what part of the sentence the word comes from and the inflection within the sentence by the order we put the words in. Changing the order would turn the sentence into nonsense, probably in most cases. In Greek, word order is not so important because it's the prefixes and suffixes, the bit you stick on the end and the beginning of each word, that really denote what that means and where that word fits in a sentence. Thirdly, when we're thinking about translation, think about whether we are looking for a literal, word-for-word translation, as we quite often will do when we're looking to translate Greek, especially in the early stages, or are we looking to convey the overall meaning of the sentence? Some Bible translations focus very much on a literal translation. Others focus more on the sentence as a whole and putting the words into an order that's more readable in English. And lastly, to understand a word, often you need to understand the context, perhaps the wider context of the sentence, but perhaps even the wider context of the paragraph as a whole. And sometimes it's not even possible to translate a word simply on its own. So most of the time, when we're trying to work out what the Bible says in the Koine Greek, we look at two main things. First, the vocabulary, what the actual word means, of course. But secondly, we spend a lot of our time doing what's known as parsing. I'll explain that in a sec. But just remember that in terms of vocabulary, firstly, each word can have what is called a broad semantic field. Not as broad as in Hebrew, but basically this means that each word can have several meanings. That does happen in English sometimes. Secondly, to look a word up in the dictionary, you need to understand what form the root word is. For an example, any verb that moves into the past tense adds an epsilon, and sometimes other things as well, at the beginning as its prefix. If you looked up in a dictionary under epsilon, that word, you wouldn't find it. You need to look up the root word. The root word will be, for a noun, the nominative singular. Whether it's masculine, feminine or neuter, it will be the nominative singular. And the root word for a verb will be the first person singular in the active voice and in the indicative mood. I will come back to what those things mean. Sometimes a word can change really quite significantly. The root word luo could become something like reruomenon if it was a middle participle. It could start with an R. It could finish with a N sound. Other words change completely. They don't just add prefixes and suffixes. They have no letters that are the same. So we need to understand what the root word is and learn how the word changes in order to be able to find that dictionary form. But a lot of the time, if you use a website or an app or some sort of software, all you have to do is click on the word and it will tell you the root form of that word and give you the parsing as well. So there are several different elements of parsing. We look for the part of the sentence the word comes from, the case a word is in, the voice that the verb is in, the mood that the verb is in, the tense it's in, and with both verbs and nouns, and as well as adjectives and pronouns and prepositions and definite articles, we also think about things like gender and number. So what do we mean by part? Well, it is basically the type of the word and where it belongs in the sentence. A definite article, in English this is usually the word the. A noun, which is going to be an object, a person, a name, a city, something like that. A pronoun, such as he or she or you or we. The verbs are the doing words. Participles. These derive from verbs but act like adjectives or sometimes nouns. And then there are adverbs and adjectives and a few other things that we will come to later on in the course. With nouns, pronouns, participles, adjectives and adverbs, we will look at the case. The cases are nominative, vocative, accusative, genitive and dative. In Latin, you do also sometimes get the ablative, but that's not really so relevant in Greek. So if we have a little look at what those different terms mean, a nominative is the noun, nouns or pronouns in the sentence that is doing the verb. So it is the one that is acting upon that verb. Here's an example. Jesus rode a donkey into Jerusalem. Jesus is the noun and it is in the nominative because it is doing the verb rode. The accusative is the direct object in the sentence. Again, a noun. The object of the action of the verb. So in this case, Jesus rode a donkey into Jerusalem. Donkey is the object of the verb to ride and therefore it is the accusative. The dative is a noun within the sentence that is any subsequent indirect object or objects after the accusative. In this example, Jesus rode a donkey into Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the indirect object. Donkey was the direct object that the verb was directed towards, and Jesus was the nominative performing the verb. The genitive is about possession or a close association of something. Here are some examples. The voice came from heaven and said, "This is my son." This is God speaking, and it's his son, talking about Jesus at the baptism by John. Jesus replied to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." Well, the noun in this case, kingdom, is going to be in the genitive case because it is Jesus who possesses it. And then there is the vocative. I've left this to last because it's not used that regularly, but the vocative is used to address somebody or something or invoke somebody. The noun takes a vocative ending when you're addressing somebody, particularly God, for example. The most classic example being, "O Lord my God." The word "O" in this case is probably the most common way that we translate the vocative, And in the Bible, the vocative most commonly addresses God. Two other things we need to think about with nouns. Each noun will either be a masculine, a feminine, or a neuter, regardless of whether it's a person or animal with an actual gender or whether it's an object. It will either be masculine, or it will be feminine, or it will be neuter. And then these can come in singular or plural, as well as coming in things like nominative, vocative, dative, accusative, and genitive. A few other points to remember about nouns. The case, number, and gender of the word is denoted by the way it ends, not by where it is in the sentence. Adjectives will agree with the noun that they are describing, so their ending will also be like that noun's ending. Pronouns, similarly, will have the same sort of ending, or something similar to it. And the definite article again will be the same or similar. It will correspond with it. This means that if a noun is masculine, nominative, singular, for example, which is the root version of a noun, then the definite article will be as well. For example, the well-known word logos, which means word, that is his example as a masculine, nominative, singular. That would go with ho, which is also masculine, nominative, and singular. So you'd get ho logos, as we get at the beginning of John's Gospel. This means the word. So let's move on to verbs. I've colour-coded this section in green for you, because if you're a visual learner like me, I find that helps a bit to colour-code things. So verbs, here we go. The things we're going to look for when we parse a verb are the tense, the person, the number, the mood, and the voice. The tenses that you'll come across in Koine Greek are present, future, aorist, imperfect, perfect, and occasionally the pluperfect. Tenses convey the point in the timeline of the sentence in which the verb is acting. We could also group these tenses by thinking of them as the past complete, the past active that are still happening, or the present, or the future. The present tense is acting now. The future tense will act. It's yet to happen. The aorist is normally used as a past tense for something that happened once in the past. It is also used sometimes for a one-off act in the present tense. The imperfect is something that started in the past and is still happening. The perfect is something that happened in the past and has been completed. The pluperfect is basically something that happened before those other past tenses, perfect and imperfect and aorist. So here are some examples of what they would sound like doing this in English. The present tense, maybe a verb like pray. I say a prayer. If you put that in the future, it would be I will say a prayer for you. You might add a word like later on. I will say a prayer for you later. An aorist, remember, is a once off. So you would translate that as I said a prayer for you. You might put yesterday, for example, whenever you said the prayer. Imperfect is usually translated with the word was and an ing word in English. I was praying for you, and its aspect is that it is ongoing, whereas the perfect is a completed action. So it was begun in the past and has been brought to completion. So I have prayed for you. And the pluperfect is a tense which gives us an act before that past tense, before the perfect usually. So I had said a prayer before dinner, now I'm eating. The eating bit is in the present tense. Dinner there is in the past, and the I had said is an event before that past event, the making of the dinner. So the pluperfect. But that's pretty rare in the New Testament. The other thing that we need to know about verbs is the person and the number. So number is simple, whether it's plural or singular. And the person. So first person would be I or me or my or mine if it's singular, and we or us or ours if it's plural. The second person is you. Now in English we don't have different words for this, whether it's singular or plural, it's still you or yours. But in Greek you'll see there's a difference between you singular and you plural, as there are in many languages. The third person singular is he, she, his or hers. And the third person plural we would translate with things like they, them, or if it belonged to somebody, theirs. Then there is mood. The four main moods are indicative, serving as a sign or an indication of something happening. Most verbs in English are indicative. They're basically the most simple form of a verb. Subjunctive is something that happens in order that something else can happen, a verb expressing either what is imagined or wished to be possible. Infinitive is a verb that has the basic form of the verb concept without any other inflection. It's usually translated with to before it, so to have faith, for example. The imperative is about giving an instruction or a command to do something. So some examples of those. Indicative, Jesus died on the cross. An aorist, because it's saying a once-off thing that happened in the past, but that's an example of an indicative verb. A subjunctive, Jesus died in order that we might have eternal life. You'll often see in the subjunctive that the English translation will say something like in order that, or so that we may, or something like that. Infinitive, Jesus knelt in the garden to pray. As I said, the word to often before the basic form of the verb without inflection. An imperative, in the Garden of Gethsemane again, Jesus told the disciples, keep watch. He's telling them, he's instructing them to do something, so it's imperative. Now let's look at participles. I put this in a different colour coding because they're a little bit different from verbs as such. Participles are derived from verbs, and they're actually very common in Greek, much more so than in English. They can act as an adjectives, but they can also take the place of a noun or act as a noun denominator. Because they are both like nouns and adjectives and they are like verbs, both sets of parsing rules apply. We've got to therefore work out 6 things when we look at a participle. This means that they are often quite difficult to translate, and that's good really, because it means that we can find out something from the Greek that is difficult to find out just by looking at the English translation. So these are the 6 things that we look for, and I've abbreviated some of these terms here, but the mood is participle, that's what we're looking at. Secondly, the case, whether it's going to be nominative, vocative, accusative, genitive or dative. Then the number, whether it's singular or plural. The gender, whether it's masculine, feminine or neuter. The tense, which includes present, perfect and aorist. There's no examples of future participles in the New Testament, and I think there's hardly any imperfect ones. And then there's also the voice as well, whether it's active, middle or passive. That means the charts for how you parse a participle are huge, and there's lots of endings to understand, but you will come to recognize in general what they look like. It can seem with the participle that there's a huge amount to do, but of course for many of us we can simply use parsing software or an app to tell us these different parts. What we need to do is know what those different parts mean, and that's why I'm doing this lesson on the grammar in English. So when you look it up and you see that it's a nominative or a dative, you see it's plural or singular or masculine, feminine, or perfect or present or middle or passive or whatever, you will know how that word is then translated. Quite often participles are translated into ing words in English. Now, talking about apps and software and things, here's an example on screen. Greek New Testament study app by Claypot Frog Software. I have this installed on my phone and you can find it on Google Play. Here is a screenshot from my phone. You can see that I've clicked on the word egenetor. Now the root form of it is ginomai. As I said, it can be quite different in the root form. It tells you here what the word means, and the number shows you how often that word in its different forms is used in the New Testament. This one's quite a common word. It tells you here that it's an aorist, a middle indicative, and that it is in the third person singular. I wonder, you might want to pause the video a minute, but I wonder if you could have a go at thinking about how you would put the word I come into an aorist middle indicative in the third person singular. Don't worry too much about the middle bit, because any word that is coming or going will be in the middle anyway. I wonder if you could work that one out. I come in the third person, it's going to be he. We're talking about Jesus, so it's going to be a man, and it would move into the past tense, one off that act in the past because it's aorist, so it would be he came. In this case, he came, this man, having been sent, apostolmenos, which is a participle of the word apostle, which means someone who is sent. But here is another example. This is from the SBL app, also on my phone, where I click on the word and the breakdown gives me this. It gives ginomai, to become or to be, but it says abbreviations of the different parts of the parsing. So VB stands for verb, AOR for aorist, mid for middle, ind for indicative, and 3S stands for third person singular. So you're going to have to be aware of what the abbreviations are, and different books and software actually use different ones, which can be annoying, but I'm going to show you the most common ones. Before I do that, I'll just point out also that some of these apps will also give you a concordance. I've just cut off the top part of it, but this page would show me all the different places that word occurs in the New Testament. Now, as I said, verbs like this can come in many different forms, and the root form is ginomai in this case. But some concordances will show you all the occurrences of the word ginomai in all its forms. Others will show you how many times that word occurs in that form. So in this case, this concordance is highlighting the other examples that ginomai appears as an aorist, middle indicative, third person singular. So it's showing you the other uses of the word egenetor specifically, and not all the forms of ginomai. I think most concordances will show you all the forms of the word, and that can be quite helpful, but this is also quite helpful if you're looking at particular word study and how things are used. So the two different approaches have their different advantages. So just quickly, I just want to think about what some of those abbreviations are, and I put them up on the screen for you. So things like VB for verb, prep for preposition. Most of them are quite obvious, really. Art for definite article. As I said, some books use different ones. For example, the lexicon that I use uses one letter, so it would be easy to mix up middle and masculine. So you have to know which order then that it's going to do the parsing in order to know which of those it is. But usually most of these apps will give you a 3 or 4 word abbreviation that makes it obvious which one it is. Using these abbreviations can basically help to make things a bit quicker, and they take up less room, of course. Act, mid and pass obviously are active, middle and passive. And here are the tenses. Again, pretty obvious. There is, as well as the aorist, a second aorist. Second aorists behave in exactly the same way. They mean the same things, but the forms of the words are different. They have slightly different endings and forms. They are irregular, and we will come to that again when we look at words that fit into that. A word will either be of one type or the other. It won't move between the two. It will be an aorist or it will be a second aorist. The moods here again are fairly obvious. Remember not to mix up imperative and imperfect. Usually they have an F somewhere in the imperfect. And the cases again are quite obvious. Non-voc, ac, gen, dat. The genders would be abbreviated like this. Sometimes it's just MC, FM or NT, but this is probably the most common way they're abbreviated. And singular or plural, you'll probably be aware of these sorts of abbreviations and will have seen them in other languages if you have learnt English as a second language or done French or German or Latin or whatever. So it can seem that there is a great deal to know just about parsing, and I recommend to you that you really thoroughly learn this English part, understand your grammar. And one of the main reasons for that is because as we learn, think of your brain like a library. You need to know which floor to go to, which aisle to go down, which shelf to put it on, and where to file it. By understanding the structure of Koine Greek, as you learn things, you will file them into your mental library, your mental lexicon, and that is proven to be really helpful in terms of memorizing things. Some people use different memory techniques to help them do this. But basically, I think it's really important to understand that structure as we begin and before we start setting out and actually learning Greek words. So that video lays out for you the basic structure in English of what the Greek language is like, and I would recommend to you to get your head around things like the tenses and the moods and the voice before we start out on the Greek, and then as you learn that information, you know where to file it in your brain basically. And you might also want to refer back to this video as we move on looking at different things. Thanks a lot for coming along. You might want to look next at learning the Greek alphabet. Diphthongs, which is related to the alphabet, is pairs of letters. And then the definite article, those are the first 3 that you should check out as you're learning, and then they will give you recommendations for moving further and learning a little bit more. Thank you for coming along. Do hit like if you like it, hit subscribe if you want to hear when there's updates on this channel. Otherwise, goodbye and God bless.